Hello, it's that police officer here. Today, we are going to look at a true crime story that is as disturbing as it is tragic. It's a case that started with an innocent online interaction but ended in an act of brutal violence. A crime that shocked a quiet neighborhood and left a family devastated. A man found bound, gagged, and left for dead. His final moments filled with unimaginable horror. Tonight, we delve into a case that unfolded in Chicago's Norwood Park neighborhood, a place where such crimes are almost unheard of. A 63-year-old man met two strangers on a dating app, unaware that he was stepping into a nightmare. Hours later, his sister would make a gruesome discovery in the basement of his own home. What led to this? Who were these men? And how did a simple meeting turn into a crime so brutal that even the judge overseeing the case was left shocked? We will break down the timeline of events, the investigation that followed, and the courtroom battle that is now underway. But before we get into the details, let's take a moment to reflect on just how easily trust can be betrayed in the digital age. How a single encounter can turn fatal. This is the case of George N. Levin, and it's one that will leave you questioning just how well you truly know the people you meet online. If you're new here, welcome to That Police Officer's channel. This channel is dedicated to bringing you real crime stories from a law enforcement perspective. We go beyond the headlines, breaking down cases with detailed insights into the investigations and legal proceedings. If you appreciate fact-based, professional, and true crime storytelling, consider subscribing, hit the like button too, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now, let's get into the case. It was a January night in Chicago when a woman heard an unusual noise coming from her brother's unit. What she didn't know at the time was that just beyond that door, something horrific had already taken place. By the time she realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Her brother, a man in his 60s, had been bound with duct tape, his mouth gagged, his body left motionless in the basement of their shared building. The people responsible for this crime had already fled, but they didn't just vanish into the night. They made crucial mistakes that would soon lead authorities straight to them. This case isn't just about a brutal crime. It's about deception, premeditation, and the cold, calculated actions of two men who saw an opportunity and took it without remorse. They didn't just take a life. They tried to erase every trace of their crime, making sure their victim couldn't call for help. But as you'll soon find out, justice has a way of catching up, even when criminals think they've covered their tracks. In the next few minutes, we'll examine how investigators put together the puzzle pieces, how surveillance footage, digital footprints, and witness statements played a critical role in bringing two suspects to justice. But before we get into the forensics, let's take a step back and look at who George N. Levin was and how his fateful encounter with two strangers would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of 2025. Stay with me. This is just the beginning. What began as an ordinary evening for 63-year-old George N. Levin ended in a brutal attack that would leave the community in shock. Levin, a longtime resident of the area, lived in a two-unit building with his sister, who occupied a separate unit within the same structure. What she would discover that night would become the center of an intense murder investigation. Levin had reportedly met two men through the dating app Grindr earlier that evening. The suspects, later identified as 21-year-old Geiderwuin Bello and 29-year-old Jefferson Ubilla-Delgado, allegedly entered his home under the pretense of a social visit. However, their true intentions were far more sinister. By the time the night was over, Levin would be found in his basement, bound with duct tape and an extension cord, his mouth gagged with a sock. The violent nature of the crime left no doubt that this was not a simple robbery. It was a targeted act of brutality. At approximately 8 p.m., Levin's sister heard a loud noise coming from his unit. Concerned, she went to check on him and was met by a man emerging from Levin's bedroom. When she asked about her brother, the man reassured her, claiming Levin would call her later. Trusting this statement, she returned to her unit. However, when she tried to contact her brother about half an hour later, the messages she received in return seemed unusual, as if someone else was responding on his behalf. Her concern grew, but it wasn't until 2 hours later that she decided to force her way into his apartment. The sight that greeted her was devastating. Levin was unresponsive, his body cold to the touch. He had been restrained and left helpless. Frantically, She removed the duct tape from his mouth and attempted CPR while waiting for paramedics to arrive. But it was too late. Levin was rushed to Ascension Resurrection Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. An autopsy later confirmed that he had suffered multiple injuries from the assault, solidifying the case as a homicide. As news of the crime spread, investigators quickly turned their attention to the two men who had last been seen with Levin. Surveillance footage from that same night showed Bello Morales and Ubilla-Delgado using Levin's phone and credit cards at local stores, making purchases and attempting to withdraw money from his bank account. Reports later revealed that the suspects had even made over $4,000 worth of purchases through Levin's Amazon account. The case took a significant turn when police were able to track down and arrest Ubilla-Delgado on December 29th, just days after the murder. During questioning, he implicated Bello Morales, stating that his accomplice had been the one to assault Levin before taking his belongings. This testimony, along with the mounting evidence, led to the arrest of both men. Authorities soon pieced together a chilling narrative of premeditated violence. What should have been a simple meeting arranged through a dating app had turned into a carefully orchestrated crime, with two individuals exploiting their victims' trust for financial gain. However, their recklessness left a trail of digital and physical evidence that would ultimately seal their fate. As the case made its way to court, prosecutors wasted no time outlining the gravity of the crime. Judge William Fahey, who presided over the case, was quick to express his shock at the level of violence involved. During their initial court appearance on February 1st, the suspects were denied bail, with the judge emphasizing the sheer brutality of the crime. The full details of the investigation, including how authorities meticulously pieced together the events of that fateful night, would soon emerge. But one thing was already clear: this was not a random act. It was a deliberate and calculated crime, carried out by two men who believed they could walk away without consequences. In the next section, we will break down how investigators gathered the crucial evidence that led to their arrests, how forensic analysis played a key role in the case, and the strategies used by law enforcement to bring these men to justice. Stay with me as we uncover the deeper layers of this disturbing case. The discovery of George N. Levin's body set off an intense and urgent police investigation. From the moment officers arrived at the scene, every step taken was crucial in piecing together the brutal crime that had unfolded in the basement of his home. The priority was clear: secure the area, document every piece of evidence, and identify the individuals responsible before they had the chance to disappear. When officers entered Levin's unit, they immediately noted the signs of a violent struggle. The basement, where Levin's body was found, told a disturbing story. His hands and feet were bound with an extension cord, his mouth gagged with a sock, and duct tape was wrapped tightly around his face. This wasn't just an attack, it was calculated. Someone had gone through the effort of ensuring their victim couldn't scream or escape. Photographs were taken from every angle. The scene was carefully processed, with forensic experts collecting DNA samples, fingerprints, and any trace evidence that might provide insight into what had happened. A preliminary examination indicated that Levin had suffered multiple injuries, but the exact cause of death would be determined through an autopsy. Meanwhile, officers searched the rest of the home. Something important was missing: Levin's phone and wallet. Given the nature of the crime, robbery was an immediate consideration, but the level of violence suggested there was more to the story. The most critical witness was Levin's sister. She described hearing a loud bang coming from his unit that night. More importantly, she recalled an encounter with a man leaving her brother's bedroom. His words still echoed in her mind: "Yes, I am with your brother. I will have him call you." That single interaction raised a red flag. Who was this man, and why was he alone in Levin's home? Her statement gave investigators an immediate lead. She was able to provide a description of the individual, and her persistence in checking on her brother ultimately led to the discovery of his murder. But there was another key detail. When she initially texted Levin after the encounter, his responses seemed off, as if someone else had been replying in his place. Investigators quickly moved to trace Levin's phone activity. They obtained records of recent transactions, phone calls, and messages. It didn't take long for them to find something that stood out. His credit cards were being used at multiple locations shortly after the estimated time of death. Surveillance footage was reviewed, and there they were, two men attempting to use Levin's cards at a vape shop and a gas station. The surveillance footage provided investigators with clear images of the suspects. With the help of facial recognition databases and previous records, they were soon able to put names to the faces: Geiderwuin Bello Morales and Jefferson Ubilla-Delgado. Further inquiries revealed that both men had recently moved to the United States, Bello Morales from Ecuador and Ubilla-Delgado from Venezuela. Police began tracking their movements. Digital evidence played a key role. Levin's phone had been used to make over $4,000 in Amazon purchases. With every fraudulent transaction, the suspects left a trail that led straight to them. The next step was locating them. Surveillance footage helped narrow their whereabouts, and within days, authorities caught a break. On December 29th, Ubilla-Delgado was apprehended. During questioning, he quickly shifted blame, telling investigators that it was Bello Morales who had physically assaulted Levin and taken his phone and cards. With Ubilla-Delgado in custody, police intensified their search for Bello Morales. They knew time was of the essence. If he realized his accomplice had been caught, he might attempt to flee. Working off phone records and known associates, authorities tracked his location and moved in swiftly. The arrest was made without incident. Both men were now in custody, and the weight of the evidence against them was overwhelming. The next phase of the case would unfold in the courtroom, where prosecutors would lay out the brutal details of what had transpired that night. The investigation had been methodical, with each step leading detectives closer to the truth. From the moment the crime scene was secured to the tracking of financial transactions and surveillance footage, every piece of evidence brought law enforcement closer to justice. But one lingering question remained. What had truly motivated this crime? Was it premeditated, or had things spiraled out of control? As the case moved forward, more details would emerge, shedding light on the dark motives behind this senseless act of violence. In the next section, we will examine the legal proceedings, the arguments presented by both sides, and the fate that awaited the two men who thought they could get away with murder. Stay with me as we continue uncovering the full story. With both Geiderwuin Bello Morales and Jefferson Ubilla-Delgado in custody, the focus of the case shifted to the legal system. The evidence against them was compelling: surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, phone records, and financial transactions all painted a clear picture of their involvement. Prosecutors wasted no time in formally charging them with first-degree murder and robbery against a victim over 60 years old, both serious felony charges that could result in life sentences if convicted. On February 1, 2025, the two men appeared before a Cook County judge for the first time. The courtroom was tense. The brutal nature of the crime had sent shockwaves through the community, and many were eager to see justice served. As the charges were read aloud, neither suspect showed much emotion. They stood before the judge as prosecutors laid out the grim details of their alleged actions: the deception, the assault, the robbery, and the ultimate murder of George N. Levin. Judge William Fahey made it clear that the severity of the crime could not be overlooked. Given the overwhelming evidence and the violent nature of the offense, he denied pretrial release for both men. They would remain behind bars as they awaited trial. As the legal process unfolded, prosecutors worked to strengthen their case. The forensic evidence, including DNA and fingerprint analysis, further confirmed that both men had been inside Levin's home. The surveillance footage not only placed them at the scene, but also captured them attempting to use Levin's stolen credit cards within hours of his death. One of the biggest turning points came from Ubilla-Delgado himself. After his arrest, he had initially tried to distance himself from the crime, claiming that it was Bello Morales who had assaulted Levin. However, under pressure from investigators and facing the possibility of life in prison, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for a potential plea deal. His statements gave prosecutors additional insight into what had happened that night: how the two men had entered Levin's home under the pretense of a meeting arranged through a dating app, how they had restrained and beaten him, and how they had stolen his belongings before fleeing. Defense attorneys, however, had a different strategy. They argued that there was no direct evidence showing exactly how Levin had died. While the medical examiner had ruled his death a homicide, the defense suggested that there was no proof their clients had intended to kill him. They also claimed that the suspects had received Levin's phone and credit cards as part of a payment for consensual services, a statement that prosecutors and the victim's family strongly refuted. When the trial commenced, the courtroom was packed. Family members, members of the press, and concerned residents all watched as the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. The state relied heavily on the digital trail the suspects had left behind. Every transaction made with Levin's credit cards, every text message sent from his stolen phone, and every second of surveillance footage added to the prosecution's case. Levin's sister took the stand, recounting the chilling moment she found her brother's lifeless body. Her testimony was heartbreaking and reinforced the brutality of the crime. Prosecutors argued that this was not a simple robbery but a planned and violent attack. They pointed out that the suspects had bound and gagged Levin, leaving him in a state where he could not call for help or defend himself. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, suggesting that there was no clear motive for murder and that the situation had escalated unexpectedly. But the forensic evidence, the financial transactions, and the eyewitness accounts all worked against them. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Both Geiderwuin Bello Morales and Jefferson Ubilla-Delgado were found guilty of first-degree murder and robbery. The weight of the evidence had left little room for doubt. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Judge Fahey did not hold back in his final statements. He emphasized the sheer brutality of the crime and the callousness with which the two men had treated their victim. To call this a violent crime is an understatement, he stated. Given the severity of their actions, both men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Levin's family, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it did not erase the pain of their loss. His sister, who had discovered his body and fought tirelessly for justice, expressed relief that those responsible would never be able to harm another person again. This case served as a grim reminder of the dangers lurking in online interactions. It also highlighted the importance of forensic technology, surveillance footage, and digital tracking in solving modern crimes. The swift action by investigators and the compelling presentation by prosecutors ensured that justice was served. While the legal process had concluded, the scars left by this crime would remain. The Norwood Park community had been shaken by the brutality of the attack, and for those closest to George and Levin, the loss was immeasurable. But in the end, the system had worked. The meticulous efforts of law enforcement, the dedication of prosecutors, and the determination of a family seeking justice had ensured that two dangerous individuals were taken off the streets. The case had come to a close, but the lessons it left behind would not be forgotten. Some cases stay with you long after the investigation is over. This was one of them. It was not just a crime. It was a brutal betrayal of trust, a reminder of the hidden dangers that exist even in places we consider safe. George N. Levin was a man who lived his life quietly, never expecting that an online interaction would lead to such a horrific fate. His death was not just a tragedy for his family, but a wake-up call for an entire community. For his sister, the pain of that night will never fade. She did everything she could. She listened for signs. She asked questions. She tried to intervene. And yet, in just a few hours, her brother was gone. The heartbreak of discovering him in such a terrible state is something no family should ever have to endure. Beyond the grief of one family, this case exposed a harsh reality about the risks of online interactions. Technology has changed the way we connect, but with that convenience comes danger. Levin's case is a stark reminder that criminals now use these platforms to prey on victims, luring them into dangerous situations under false pretenses. It's a modern threat, but one that law enforcement is increasingly aware of. For the officers and investigators who worked this case, it was a race against time. Gathering evidence, tracking suspects, ensuring that justice would be served. And in the end, they did just that. The two men responsible were held accountable, their crimes laid bare in a court of law. But no sentence, no conviction, can bring back the life that was taken. Justice may bring closure, but it does not erase loss. As we close this case, we are left with unsettling questions. How many more victims are out there? How many crimes go unreported? And what can we do to protect ourselves and those we love? These are the questions that linger, the lessons we must take forward. At the end of the day, this case is not just about crime. It's about awareness, about being cautious with who we trust, about knowing that even in an age where we are more connected than ever, true safety comes from vigilance. I'm that police officer, and this is just one of many stories that need to be told. If you found this case as unsettling as I did, consider subscribing to the channel. Stay aware, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe. Until next time.